has gone the 9 o'clock for today. Okay, let me just admit people to the meeting quickly. It has gone 9 o'clock. This is the Education Committee meeting. My name is Deirdre Bartman. I chair the committee meeting. Today we will be dealing with the report from the Equal Education Centre on inclusive education. It will be followed by the Western Cape Education Department presentation on inclusive education. I just would like to note that it is two different inclusive educations. The departmental one refers to special needs, which stems from a resolution from the previous cluster oversight visit in the Beto area. Colleagues, with that, I'm going to ask that you just introduce yourselves. Then if Equal Education, I see Ms. Bia is online, if she can just introduce herself and her team, and then just the WCED. I think it's Mr. Nika that's online. He can just introduce himself and his team as well. And then we're going to jump straight into the presentations and questions and answers. Because the two presentations are on two different topics, what I'll do is I'll do the first presentation first, followed by questions and answers. And then we'll do the second presentation, followed by questions and answers. And members, after that, please don't run away because we still need to deal with some resolutions relating to the annual report. Thank you so much. With that, members, if you can introduce yourselves.
Good morning, everybody. Member Christopher Fry.
Morning.
Good morning, Dan Plato. Thank you.
Morning.
Good morning,
everybody. Member Syed, Khalid Syed.
Thank you so much. Member Brancase and Member Syed is so excited for the meeting. Wonderful. Anyone else?
Very excited.
Wonderful. I'm always happy when you're happy to spend the morning with me. Okay. Just from Equal Education side, Ms. Priya, if you can just introduce your delegation.
Good morning. My name is Robin Beer. I'm the Deputy Director of the Equal Education Law Centre, and I'm joined by my colleagues Gertrude Kwan and Yolisa Poliso and Chandra Stearman.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Mr. Nika, if you can just introduce your team for the second presentation later.
Good morning, Chairperson and honourable members and Ms. Beer and their colleagues. Mrs. Daniels is with me. She'll introduce herself and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much. Colleagues, we're going to jump straight into the presentation. I just would like to remind everyone, if you're not on the floor, just to please keep your video and your mic off. Otherwise, we are going to have some feedback on the system as well. Member Karma, I see your hand. Welcome.
Good morning, Chair, and good morning, members. Apologies for trying to log in. My name is Mesuli Kama, alternate member to the committee. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you so much for joining. You know, I'm always excited when more people join the committee meeting. It makes me feel very important. Thank you so much. Ms. Breer, over to you.
Thank you very much and good morning again. We would really just like to express our appreciation for this opportunity. We have done a lot of work on this report and we really have valued the engagements that we've been able to have with various stakeholders around some of the recommendations. And so we're looking forward to a similar engagement with you. So thank you, Honourable Chair and members, for inviting us to share these findings. And I'll jump right into it. I'll share my screen so that you have our presentation. Right, I'm trusting you can all see it. So just to provide a little bit of context, the Law Centre undertook last year a sort of year-long process of trying to conduct what we hope to be a fairly comprehensive review of essentially the regulatory framework that governs inclusive education in South Africa. We wanted to look at the various laws and policy commitments that had been made over the years and to try and do an analysis of whether or not those commitments have been implemented, to what extent they've been implemented, where have been some of the obstacles or challenges or stumbling blocks, and where does that leave us? What do we need to do now in order to sort of accelerate the implementation of inclusive education? So we looked particularly at obviously White Paper 6 being the primary policy document relating to the vision of inclusive education in South Africa as it was at the time. And obviously also the CIAS policy, which is a fairly substantial policy to ensure that there is standardized support provision across all schools in the country. And then we looked at various other pieces of legislation and policy, and we primarily used government's own reporting in order to try and assess to what extent implementation has taken place. I did just want to start by making sure that we all shared a common understanding of inclusive education, and the stance taken through the report has largely been that we understand inclusive education essentially to be, as it is articulated in the Salamanca Statement of '94, which says that all children should learn together wherever possible, regardless of any difficulties or differences they may have. Inclusive schools must recognize and respond to the diverse needs of their learners. This was affirmed in the Incheon Declaration, which also said that our commitment should be to addressing all forms of exclusion and marginalization, disparities and inequalities in access, participation and learning outcomes. So this idea of all means all, or no child left behind, really means that every child, irrespective of their socioeconomic standing, their learning ability, their sexual orientation, gender identity, religious affiliation, ability, all children are able to be supported in their local school and receive the support they need to achieve their full potential. So it's with that view of inclusive education that we undertook this exercise. Unfortunately, our regulatory framework as it stands, and to a large extent the implementation of inclusive education, has been quite narrowly viewed in South Africa as being about education for children with disabilities. And whilst we all acknowledge and understand that learners with disabilities are by far the most marginalized and excluded in our education system, the education of learners with disabilities is not what we understand broader inclusive education to be about. So at times the report did seem skewed towards a focus on education of children with disabilities, but we want to just keep in mind that at all times we are thinking broadly about making sure every child receives quality education, and particularly those most marginalized, including children with disabilities. So that's just really to set the scene. We're going to look at this, look in White Paper 6, there were sort of 6 key pillars or strategy areas that were sort of made the commitments that needed to be achieved in order to create this inclusive education system. And we're going to look at each of those and spend a little bit of time understanding what the report found and what our recommendations are on the basis of those findings. So I'm going to kick us off with this idea of special school resource centres. Of course, White Paper 6 said that our special schools could have a place in an inclusive education system if they were converted into resource centres and were able to provide support not only to the learners that were included within those schools, but also to the neighbouring ordinary schools, so that learners with disabilities could also be included into those ordinary schools. So as we all know, the goal of the UNCRPD is for full inclusion, which means no parallel system of education. All children are accommodated in ordinary schools. We do acknowledge and accept that in South Africa, we are unlikely to achieve that goal, given our resource constraints, and also, to be honest, very few countries in the world have achieved a goal of full inclusion. In most countries, there is some acknowledgement that there is still a role for special schools. And so White Paper's envisaging of special schools acting as resource centres, being able to provide specialised support to ordinary schools, was a sound rationale and way of dealing with the special schools that we already had. So if we had to then take a look and say, well, the goal was that our special schools got converted to resource centres. How well have we done? And the DBE reported that about 142 out of the 435 public special schools were converted after 20 years, which is less than 30%. And we do note from the Western Cape's annual report that the number of special schools that have been converted in the Western Cape stands at around 40%. So we do acknowledge that the Western Cape is doing slightly better than the rest of the country. But I guess what we all need to say and ask ourselves is, after 20 years, do we feel that we've made enough progress to say that less than half of our special schools are actually functioning as resource centres in the way that it was envisaged? So that's one of our big concerns. The other concern we have, and it was borne out by the Auditor General's report on full service schools, is that whilst we have numbers, we know that 142 out of 435 schools are resource centres, there's not a lot of data to tell us how well are they actually functioning as resource centres. So according to the criteria that we would say would indicate a well-functioning resource centre, to what extent are these schools functioning as such? Without that data, it's very difficult to be able to say that even those 142 are fulfilling their role adequately as a resource centre. The other issue that White Paper 6 that we had around the special school situation was that special schools, we acknowledge, and is historically so, that the majority of special schools in our country are in the urban provinces, by far the majority in the Western Cape and Gauteng. And those schools are traditionally the better resourced schools, particularly in and around the city centres. So of those 400 odd special schools, the Western Cape and Gauteng have the majority. And it is certainly fair to say, and unfortunately remains the case today, that the special schools that traditionally serve rural provinces and township areas remain more poorly resourced than our urban schools. And unfortunately, what we noticed in doing this research is reports continuously keep coming out about the shocking conditions in many of our special schools. So this idea that a child with a disability is better served in a highly specialized school with access to specialist therapists and daily intensive therapies and support is really not true for many of our special schools, where many of them have no therapists, there is inadequate care and supervision, there are cases of abuse and neglect. So, you know, if our special schools are to function as these highly specialized environments to provide for the learners who have the highest level of support need, and to then also be able to act as a resource, we have to make sure that they are properly functioning. So we feel that in terms of the goal for White Paper 6 of having these resource centres that are specialised, well-functioning resource centres, we haven't achieved that in 20 years. So our recommendations in this regard: to urgently prioritise upgrading the poorly resourced and dilapidated special schools that do exist, prioritise the conversion of all special schools. I think we all agree that to wait another 20 years just at the same rate of conversion would really be a disservice to our children. And adequate monitoring of the functioning of these resource centres, not just the numbers that have been converted. And until such time as we're able to get the existing schools functioning well, to not continue to build new special schools. Our concern around the sort of building of new special schools is the huge costs of sustaining those schools going forward, where that funding could now be focused more towards ensuring inclusion in ordinary schools, which is ultimately the goal that we're working towards. Right, so I'm going to move on now to full service schools, which was the other sort of pillar in White Paper 6. And it was really this idea that in an inclusive education system, all of our ordinary schools should be inclusive, which means every child should be able to go with their peers, with their friends, to their local neighbourhood school, so they can live in community and they can learn in all of their diversity. We're all different, we all learn differently. Some of us have different abilities, some of us just learn in different ways. Some people need more support, some different support. And the idea is that we can all be accommodated in our local school, and that's the goal. So the idea was to take this idea of what should an inclusive ordinary school look like, and to start to develop our ordinary schools with the goal that ultimately every school should be, an ordinary school should mean you are an ordinary inclusive school. Unfortunately, this intention, as our report showed, really hasn't played out. The target that White Paper 6 set was about 500 schools. The DBE reported that they had 848 schools at the end of the term, 20-year term of White Paper 6, but even that on its own is about 3% of all ordinary schools. So we haven't achieved any kind of systemic transformation when it comes to our ordinary school system. And then what was possibly the most concerning were the findings of the Auditor General's report in 2019. And that report essentially showed across all the indicators that those 848 schools were not functioning as they were supposed to. In fact, about 80% of them were not functioning as effectively as full service schools. So to say again, this idea of, well, we've more than achieved the target of 500 schools, but actually 80% of them aren't functioning, so we haven't achieved even that target. We certainly haven't achieved systemic transformation. And even in the Western Cape, you know, initially there were 108 schools that had previous adaptation or special classes that were deemed or designated full service schools, but you know, there was an understanding that that possibly wasn't the best way to go. And so then there was this idea of rather targeting a smaller number of about 48 schools as inclusive schools. But if you look at that number of 48 schools, 20 years later, out of the 1,450 odd ordinary schools in the Western Cape, again, that's 3% of schools having been converted. So essentially our recommendation when it comes to full service schools is that the term full service school should be abandoned in favor of all schools becoming ordinary schools. The CS policy put in place a standardized system of support provision across every school. So this idea that every ordinary school should have a school-based support team, should be able to support learners in that environment, is really what the goal of an inclusive education system is. And so we feel that continuing with this idea of full service schools is a distraction. They have become essentially mini special schools with a sort of over subscription of learners who require additional support. So it's still seen as an ordinary class teacher saying, these children I'm unable to support, so I must refer them out. And I know the Western Cape Education Department shares this commitment of the idea of bringing support to the child and not having to remove the child to go and access support elsewhere. So yeah, that's our view on full service schools. So I want to quickly have a look at admission policies and practices. And there are various admission laws and policies in South Africa, South African Schools Act, the National Admissions Policy. We look at laws like PAPUDA, the CS policy. And essentially what we have found in our analysis is, as we all understand it, access to school is obviously the most fundamental and basic requirement for realizing the right to education. But there is some inconsistency and confusion amongst those policies about what access means for some learners. And there are specific challenges with terms like special education needs. What does that mean? Does that mean children with disabilities, or does that mean any child who requires any type of additional support? It could, yeah, so that has never been defined as a term, and that creates some confusion about what do we mean by special education needs. And then there's also challenges with terms like reasonable practicability and the implications that has when we're looking at the right to education. One of our biggest concerns around admission is discriminatory admission practices. And so we still find that ordinary schools in particular discriminate against learners, particularly with disabilities. According to the Schools Act, learners should be admitted into their ordinary school, and support should be provided for the learner, reasonable accommodations at that school, and placement at a special school should only be considered as a last resort. But we don't find that the case at all. We find many parents apply to their ordinary school, but the moment the school is aware that a learner might have any type of disability or learning difficulty, they're told that they're unable to deal with a learner with that type of need and they must go to a special school. So that continues to be a practice that's very concerning, and then it places parents in a very difficult position of now having to try and find placement. And where our policies are silent is on how do you get access to a special school directly. So there's no policy that speaks about admission into a special school. And the reality is, for some learners, admission to a special school would be the most appropriate space, but that should be through a CS process and with support of a district. But it's often left to parents to try and fill that gap. Our biggest concern around ordinary schools is the failure to reasonably accommodate. Many parents are told that if they would like their child to be accommodated in an ordinary school, they must pay for reasonable accommodations. They must pay for a facilitator. They must pay for a scribe if the child wants to have concessions and exams. And oftentimes that is a financial burden that parents are unable to bear. So the idea of sort of putting a condition on admission that a parent pays for support is really not, well, it's not lawful, and certainly has been one of the major barriers to accessing ordinary schools. So our recommendations around admission practices is that there needs to be clarity across the policies and laws that exist, and there needs to be clarity regarding admission to special schools and the processes around that. Okay, the next, sorry, it's a lot. It was a long report, as I'm not sure if any of you have read it all. So we're trying to condense as many of our recommendations as possible. The next issue was around teacher training, and I know that the WCED, also from your annual reports in the last few years, have also raised similar concerns around the ability of the classroom educator to be able to differentiate their teaching so that every child in their class is able to learn, differentiate assessment. And what we have seen most concerning has been progression of learners without support. So the idea in our promotion and progression policy that if a learner has not met the grade requirements for that year, and a repetition of that year is not going to help them to achieve the target, they must be progressed with their age cohort. But the idea is they need to be progressed with support. Because if you failed to meet the grade 3 requirements and you get progressed to grade 4, and you're now being taught grade 4, when you never actually got grade 3, your learning gaps get wider and wider. So the idea of progressing learners, but not then differentiating or being able to teach them at a different level, is a huge disservice to them. And what we're finding is teachers lack the skill to be able to do that. And so learners who are progressed, and there are large numbers of progressed learners, are just repeatedly taught at higher and higher grade levels without ever having achieved the requirements of the grades below. And that's particularly detrimental when it comes to your building block subjects like mathematics or language, where if you don't grasp those foundational principles, you won't be able to grasp the more complex build-upon principles. So this idea of progression without support and the teacher's inability to be able to differentiate and teach has resulted in what we see in our law clinic as many learners at grade 7 being promoted out of grade 7, ages of 14 and 15, with no prospect of being admitted into a high school on the recommendation of going to a school of skills, but essentially then being left out of school because their parents can't get them into a school of skills, or there aren't schools of skills available or close by. The department doesn't, the schools don't assist them getting in there, and they can't get into a high school. So we're seeing that as a major gap. We're getting more and more cases in that regard as well. So for us, teacher training is absolutely critical. It needs to be addressed both in pre-service and in-service training programs. And we've seen, particularly through the EU funding program, a few years ago, of some very nice gains made in terms of developing curriculum content. The Western Cape Education Department also has courses available on their online portals, but the targets haven't been met. And often what we see again is a report on the numbers of teachers trained, having gone through a 2 or a 5 day training on CS or differentiation, but no assessment of whether or not that's translated in a skill to teach inclusively. And we all know that to develop a skill is far more difficult than to just acquire knowledge of something. So I might be able to know what the CS policy says, but am I able to actually implement it? Do I have the skill to implement it in my classroom environment? So yeah, definitely it has not translated into skills development, and our recommendations are compulsory pre and in-service training on inclusive pedagogy, the induction of new teachers so that they are able to effectively, from the start of their teaching practice, teach inclusively, and monitoring skills acquisition aligned to inclusive teaching standards, which have been developed. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Yulisa, who's going to take us through a discussion on district-based support teams and school-based support teams.
Good morning, Chair, and good morning to the members and also to the WCET members present. I would ask to proceed without camera just for better audibility on my side. So I'll be focusing on the presentation of the strengthening support structures for the DBSTs, school-based support teams, and lastly, I'll be focusing on the mobilization of learners with disabilities that are out of school. And each of these topics, I will also be presenting recommendations for the consideration of the committee, but also in particular for the WCED. So on the DBSTs, the core purpose of district-based support teams is necessary to foster the development and the effective teaching and learning, primarily identifying and addressing barriers to learning at all levels of the system. Part of the role of the DBST is supporting capacity building of schools and providing direct learning support to learners. The DBSTs also plays a monitoring and evaluation role. However, part of our findings on our report have shown that there are existing implementation challenges that the DBSTs encounter. The implementation challenges noted on our report include issues of leadership and composition, resourcing, and the issue of multidisciplinary skills and knowledge. Firstly, on the issue of leadership and composition. So initially, the DBSTs were envisaged as a holistic team, not necessarily a composition of inclusive education directed only. So, however, in our research, it's been shown that the composition of the DBSTs has been misconstrued as only including the inclusive education directorate only. This misconstruction further hampers the understanding of inclusive education and further perpetuates the marginalization of broader inclusive education vision outlined in international and regional obligations. So we understand that inclusive education cuts across all directorates, including curriculum policy, support, and monitoring directorates. Therefore, the leadership and composition of the DBSTs requires inclusion of all other district-based directorates in order to promote quality and inclusive education. For an example, I would say that the inclusion of in the DBST leadership and composition, we should also have people like maybe that also have LGBTQI experience that hold expertise in that, so that we have a quite inclusive leadership and composition of the DBSTs that will then filter on better implementation on school level as well. Then on resourcing, we find that lack of resources and infrastructure is one of the impeding factors of implementation of quality inclusive education. There's also insufficient human resources have been cited by schools and DBSTs as a significant contributor in the inability of the DBSTs to perform their support role effectively. On the lack of multidisciplinary skills and knowledge, our report has further evidence that DBSTs are not adequately trained in assisting teachers or in supporting learners who experience barriers in learning in an inclusive education system. The trend we have identified from our law clinic is that learners are either pushed out of school by merely progressing from grade to grade without the provision of adequate support. In some cases, parents come through our clinic indicating that their children are being recommended to either special schools or school of skills without having any being given any form of proper support in their schools. So this evidence the lack of skills and knowledge and the implementation of quality inclusive education. We therefore recommend that the DBSTs, the district director must be held accountable for the leadership and management of the district-based support teams. We also recommend that there should be an adequate funding for the DBSTs that will also be impactful in terms of the work that is carried by DBSTs. Lastly, we also recommend monitoring and accountability mechanisms to assess the composition and the functioning of the DBSTs. Then I move further on school-based support teams. These are very pivotal people in the implementation of inclusive education because they're within the school setup and they understand the daily activities and how learners are at schools. So the role of the DBSTs is equally important as the role of the DBSTs. More especially because the DBSTs are the first point of call for support as they are situated within school structures. The SBSTs have a potential of being a good vehicle that could fuel good practice of inclusive education when they are well trained and resourced. The functioning of the SBSTs is determining the support needs of the schools, teachers, learners, and also coordinating support provision within the framework of the CS policy. We've also found that on the auditor's report, Auditor General report, which is a very big concern as well, that only 78% of the school-based support teams at full service schools were not established and did not, even those that were established did not adequately function to ensure that inclusive education is planned, implemented, recorded, and reported. So our report has revealed that several challenges faced by school-based support teams that derail realization of quality inclusive education. Some of the highlighted challenges include the role and composition. The role and the composition of the SPSTs seem to have been minimized as a pathway for referral to special schools. This inhibits the implementation of broader implementation of inclusive education, because what we see even when we are being approached by parents of children that are being referred to special schools, they only become aware of the SBSTs when the process of referring a learner to a special school is taking place. So that's why this is just being viewed as minimizing the role of SBSTs as a pathway to refer to special schools. We also found that many schools seem to be unable to establish SPSTs with the correct composition. Then there should also be the involvement of parents, community members as well, There is a role which is also important for them to play in terms of ensuring that SPSTs are supported and that are working quite perfectly. And then the role of principals is key on the composition of the SPSTs as well, as they play a role of monitoring and oversight. However, we found that where principals fail their role as part of the SPSTs, it often results to poor outcomes in terms of the work of the SPSTs. Then on skills and knowledge, there's insufficient training has been identified as a difficulty faced by SPSTs. The Western Cape study indicated that some participants also lacked the skills and expertise to fully implement inclusive education because they were not appropriately trained. Also, on the auditor's report as well, 51% of the SPSTs in full service school teachers lacked training in full service schools and in terms of implementing inclusive education. So through the engagement with some of the schools with one principal, they also indicated that they would appreciate some level of support and workshop for their SPSTs because they think that that is something that they are not really getting from the district-based support teams. However, they've also expressed their reluctancy in permitting an NGO to undertake workshops with them without obviously the approval of the district director. But this reveals then there's a need of extra capacitation required by the different SPSTs in the Western Cape. We also noted that there's the difficulty in frequency in agenda of meetings. Our findings reveal that SPSTs meet frequently, often once not once per term, and this also has dire consequences on the implementation of inclusive education. Even those monthly meetings, SPSTs simply deal with the list of identified learners that must be referred to special schools or scale of schools. Our findings also indicate that the SPSTs that were met on 2 weeks performed even better. Where there are frequent meetings, the SPSTs have more time to develop and evaluate the individual support plans and support progress learners, also review teacher training needs, and also to seek external support providers where necessary. The other issue is managing workload of teachers that form part of the SPSTs. So teachers who serve as part of the SPSTs are expected to carry their full teaching load as well as the SPST responsibilities. So this also plays a role in the difficulty of implementing quality inclusive education within schools, because they are also mindful that there's a workload which is pending on their part. So that also requires some sort of paying attention to. And on the support from the district-based support teams, many SPSTs feel unsupported by the district-based support team, and that causes a bit of dissatisfaction. The infrequent DBSTs visit sometimes once a year leaves the SPSTs feeling unsupported and alienated. So that is also another concern, that SPSTs are not receiving adequate support from the district-based support teams, which is another concerning factor. On monitoring and accountability, we've also relied on the auditor's report, which has also revealed that the majority of full service schools did not have full functioning SPSTs. This raises questions concerning the SPSTs in primary and secondary schools. Our report has revealed that high schools have fewer SPSTs than primary schools, even though all schools should have one. Considering the high rate of dropout in high schools, the need for coordinated school-based support in high schools is equally as urgent. So monitoring and accountability is crucial in the implementation of inclusive education. So the WCED should gather data also on effectiveness of the SPSTs to determine the amount of support required. Then on recommendations, we recommend that there should be more than one SPSTs in larger schools, and also guidance in the regulatory framework will also be a good intervention. We also recommend that there should be reduced time teaching for SPSTs, SPST coordinators to be provided for and costed. We also recommend that there is time commitment of SPST members to be taken into consideration. Regular comprehensive training of the SPSTs is quite pivotal, and regular and detailed monitoring and reporting on the functioning of SPSTs is also a crucial factor. Then lastly, I am also focusing on the mobilization of learners with disabilities that are out of school back into schools. So this is also largely a very problematic area in terms of the implementation of inclusive education. One of the key strategies in terms of the white paper 6 is the identification of and establishing an inclusive education system is the mobilization of learners with disabilities that are out of school. At the time when the white paper 6 was published, it was estimated at around 280,000 children with disabilities were unaccounted for in the education system in South Africa, and the Western Cape wasn't exonerated from this number. Although we've hit the 21st year since the publication of White Paper 6, mobilization of learners with disabilities back to school seemed to be a realization far from reach, which is also very important to pay attention to. Our report has revealed that there are thousands of learners with disabilities that are out of school. There is no latest data in the existing number of learners with disabilities that are out of school. The lack of data on this group of learners is quite concerning, as it may seem to suggest that there is no existing plan on the pipeline to get these learners back into schools. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child also recommends the strengthening of the data on children with disabilities that are out of school. The poor data collection hampers the efforts to implement and monitor the achievement of this goal. Also, with the DBE's stats, they've shown that in 2021, there were about 4,198 learners that remain on the waiting list of special schools, with the Western Cape with also 423 learners on the waiting list to those special schools. Through our law clinic, we have been receiving a number of parents whose children remain as part of this list. Our experience has also shown that it is even difficult for parents to get their children on these waiting lists. This is problematic, as it seemed to also to suggest that it is okay for learners with disabilities to remain at home without school placement while remaining on this list. And it should not be something which is very much acceptable or as a continuous thing, that it's okay for learners with disabilities to remain in waiting list whilst they're not accessing their right to education. It's also something important to pay attention to and worth addressing. So the implementation of quality inclusive education is a solution to the placement of some of the learners with disabilities that are out of school, even those that remain in these waiting lists. If there's a better support and resource provision for the DBSTs, for the SPSTs, the list of learners with disabilities that are out of school would at least be shortened by the placement of the learners with disabilities at ordinary public schools. So Section 29 of the Constitution ensures that it guarantees everyone that has a right to basic education, and this also includes learners with disabilities. I would also like to make mention of Section 35 of the South African Schools Act, which also places an obligation on the head of department of the Western Cape to ensure that learners that are out of school are being investigated and to understand why learners are out of school, and to ensure that those issues are being investigated, the circumstances of the learners absent to school, and also to take appropriate measures to remedy such situation. So the head of department can utilize Section 35 of the South African Schools Act in ensuring that he plays a role in mobilizing and getting out of school learners back to school. So we recommend that there's an adequate time-bound and costed plan to mobilize and place out-of-school learners, and also an accurate data must be also made available in terms of the number of learners that are out of school, and the plan thereof should be put in place. That concludes my presentation. I'll also hand back to Robin.
Thanks, Shalisa. I'm just going to very briefly finish off this presentation by speaking about funding. I'm not going to touch on the advocacy program. I think I touched on that earlier. The idea that there is a misalignment in terms of our understanding of inclusive education. But what is most important and of most concern to all of us, I think, is the idea that we don't yet have an adequate funding model to fund inclusive education. And the lack of adequate funding remains one of the greatest obstacles to implementation. Even in the costing of the guidelines for resourcing inclusive education, there is no funding provision for ordinary schools to be able to provide reasonable accommodations to learners in ordinary schools. And the reality is schools, their current budgets are struggling to be able to provide those accommodations. The majority of our funding remains channeled into our special schools, and we are disincentivizing ordinary schools from including learners because they do not have the funding to support them. So it's absolutely critical that we have to have budgets to ordinary schools to enable them to provide the support for all learners who go to those schools. An analysis of spending over the last 20 years has shown that the budget allocated to Program 4, which does fund our special school program, has remained largely unchanged. And the guidelines, unfortunately, for resourcing inclusive education were only passed as guidelines and not as norms and standards. So we are yet to see any actual funding being allocated either conditionally or through the equitable share or towards the expansion of inclusive education. Wherever provinces, and the Western Cape has been quite innovative in this way to try and make money available for inclusive education, but that money is not there. There's no actual adequate money provided for that. The only grant is the conditional grant for learners with severe to profound intellectual disability. There is no money available for ordinary schools to support. It's absolutely critical that we get this right. This was placed in all of the policy documents, CS, White Paper 6. So funding reforms urgently need to be finalized. At the moment, the funding reforms are progressive to 2030. We can't wait another 8-9 years to get adequate funding for inclusive education. Funding for reasonable accommodation in ordinary schools must be provided, and support structures need to be funded so that they're able to function effectively. And we need to be creative about the fiscal space that can be found to do this. Phasing in can't be the solution. So we feel really strongly about the funding model. We feel that it is the one thing that has prevented us getting anywhere, and we feel that it will continue to prevent us getting anywhere. And I think that's really also one of our calls in trying to engage also with the Western Cape Standing Committee, is that we start to look at sort of accountability mechanisms around funding for inclusive education. Just very briefly, we made recommendations about the regulatory framework changing. One of our big concerns is that if we are just going to simply review White Paper 6, we're going to end up in the same situation that we've had for the last 20 years, which is that White Paper 6 is a policy. It doesn't have the force of law, and it didn't have any money attached to it. And if we're just going to spend the next 5 years in a review process of White Paper 6 and set out a new policy document with another 20-year plan, We will never achieve the goals of inclusion. You can see the incremental gains where we've only achieved like 3% of schools being converted. So we strongly advise that there needs to be legislative reform. We need to see clear legal entitlements, either standalone legislation or amendments to SASSA, but we need regulations that regulate. We believe that SIAS should be elevated to the status of regulations, that the school-based support teams, the district-based support teams, and special school resources should be regulated, and special school hostels should be regulated, so that there can be some enforceability and accountability around implementation. And it goes without saying that funding is absolutely critical. So thank you very much. I'm going to end it there, and we will be available for your questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bria. Of the particular matters do relate to national mandates. However, where possible, if we can pose our questions and see where there's possible recommendations then for ourselves for afterwards. Thank you so much. I'm now going to recognize hands. If there are no hands, I'm happy to start with the questions.
After you then.
Okay, no problem. I'll start with the questions. I'm not used to this. Thank you so much. Ms. Bria, I just wanted to find out on, I think it's slide 4 of your presentation regarding one of the recommendations on moratorium on the building of new special schools. I'm not sure what the reasoning behind that is, but perhaps if you could assist. I do note that there are a number of recommendations that we may need to pose to the national department. So I will consult the members also on some of those matters. And then just on slide 8, I think, yes, it's on my page, it's page 4, but I think it's slide 8 on yours. It speaks to the school-based support teams. I just wanted to check if that was the AG report at a national level. I wasn't here in 2018, 2019, so I just want to make sure that I'm getting that one correct. I'm going to stop with those first 2 questions because in the previous education committee, member Christians reminded me of the fact that he might, report me to God if I don't allow other people in the committee to also be able to ask questions. So Member Kama and Member Syed, if you could also please pose maybe 2 questions each, because then I can hopefully take a second round of questions as well. In that order, Member Kama, Member Syed.
Thank you very much, Chair. And let me welcome the presentation by Equal Education Law Center, and let me also appreciate the work that they do, Chair, and upfront say that I have a sense that we are generally in conflict with many of the laws that would have put in place. But one question that I want to check, which might be, it might have been said on the introductory remarks, which I missed, but I wanted to check as to when was this report compiled. Are we the first people to be engaged on this? Has the department been engaged at the level of the province and the national? When was that, and what is the level of engagement? The other question that Chair I want to ask is around the issue of admission policies, and I think even Member Said would have made many statements now on broader terms around the issue of admissions to schools and the issue of schools being given, there are schools that have their own admission policies. So the question would be, does the law center believe that there should be uniform admission policy that should ensure that we have inclusive education, but also generally that all children, you know, are guaranteed equal access to education, whether it's in the public or in the independent space of education, understanding that those would also be providing education within the country that guarantees its citizens certain rights. Just as a departing comment, apologies to you, Chair, I was wondering, because the question I was going to have is around the data, because only when we understand the data of those that are children with disabilities and are out of any education offering process. So I'm really concerned that we do not have such a data. Maybe, Chair, perhaps later I will also raise this as part of the recommendations as to what is the department doing in that regard, because the department is mandated by law to make sure that each and every child has access to education, as that is their basic right, and there should be no discrimination whatsoever. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Member Kama. I just also want to remind members that the second presentation by the WCED on inclusive education is also still coming in this meeting. So perhaps some of the questions might be addressed in that presentation as well. Thank you so much. Member Syed.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think I've largely been covered by Member Kama, but just one quick one. The key thing that came out here, one of the things is the 22 learners that are on the waiting list that Equal Education have spoken about. Could we possibly get a breakdown of this per district? Have they zoomed into this, and what are the causes for this? Just wanted to get a sense of that. And then secondly, the second part is about getting right the funding model for inclusive education in the meantime, you know. I know there's work that needs to be done in terms of the long term. Do they have any recommendations, perhaps, for the department to look at a temporary approach in terms of the funding model to ensure that what they are speaking about and that the proposals can actually be implemented? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bria. I'm going to hand over to you and your delegation just for those questions, and then I'll take a second round. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Honourable Chair, in answer to your question around the moratorium on building of special schools. So the special school issue is always a difficult one because, as I said, you know, we come from this model of parallel education where children with disabilities are segregated and are placed in separate schools and educated there. And there has been a lot of appreciation and understanding that that is not necessarily in the best interests of children. For any child with a disability to be placed automatically into a special school. And that's why our policies have changed and progressed towards an inclusive education system, saying that children should be placed first and foremost in their ordinary school, and placement in a special school should be a last resort. But there is this acknowledgement that for some learners, placement in a special school is in their best interests, particularly learners with very high level support needs. Learners who have multiple or complex disabilities, learners with, for example, very low functioning autism, for whom placement in an ordinary school in our context is unrealistic. However, we do have already 500 special schools in this country. If we continue to build special schools all the time, we are never going to shift our focus towards ensuring that the majority, that 99% of our learners are in ordinary schools. We will continue with this perpetuating process of saying that children with disabilities must go to special schools. There are many children in our special schools, and I will commend the Western Cape Education Department on this. They really have done tremendous work to do sifting processes at our special schools in the Western Cape and to make sure that learners who can in fact be accommodated in ordinary schools are placed into ordinary schools. And so they, but we still in this country have schools, for example, for learners with physical disability, who have no intellectual disability, who are able to meet the grade requirements. There's no reason why that child should have to be in a special school and could not just be accommodated in their ordinary school. For many children, it is simply just creating wheelchair access to a school that would enable them to be able to go to their local school, learn, pass matric, etc., etc. So we have to shift this. We have to first of all make sure that the children who are in our existing special schools actually need to be there. In filtering and sifting some of them out, we will make space available in those special schools for more learners who need to be in special schools to be there. So there shouldn't be a need to have to keep building new special schools. Special schools are built at tremendous cost, and the cost of running them is tremendous. That money, if we continue to channel all of our funding to special schools, we will never create fiscal space for that funding to go into the ordinary school system. If we could apply that money into ordinary schools to give them some funding to be able to provide reasonable accommodations, etc., then learners could more easily be included into our ordinary schools. So it is a bit of a mindset shift to say that we need to be actually placing all of our focus and attention on how do we make our ordinary school system more inclusive than continuing with this practice of segregation. I also believe that until we start building new schools, we should be concentrating on making sure that our existing schools are well funded, are well staffed, because many of them aren't. So that really formed a lot of our motivation around saying we need to stop this sort of persisting idea of, in order to educate children with disabilities, we must build more special schools, but rather to say, in order to educate children with disabilities, let's see how we can best support them in ordinary schools, and only if necessary place them into special schools. So that's a little bit around that. We do recognize that there are exceptions to that. There are some districts and provinces where there are really no special schools, so to speak. In the Northern Cape, for example, they have 10 special schools. They're all in Kimberley. Other parts of that province are 800 kilometers away with nothing. So there may be some particular need, but that should have to be very strongly motivated for. It just can't be the default mechanism anymore. So that's an answer to that question. In terms of the school-based support team AG report, yes, it was the National Auditor General's report. And that report looked at, it was the same report that was actually looking at full service schools. So when they looked at school-based support teams, they were examining the school-based support teams in the full service schools that they audited. So it wasn't an audit of school-based support teams across the country, across all ordinary schools. It was particularly in full service schools. But it made the findings even more concerning, because if you are saying that in full service schools, which are the schools that should be capacitated and resourced to function as inclusive schools, that 80% of the school-based support teams in those schools weren't functioning, what does that say for the rest of our schools? And then Honourable Member Karma, just in terms of when our report, yes, sorry.
Please, Ms. Priya, I just want to check. Apologies, I just want to check the 2018 report, was it a national report?
Yes, national.
Because I tried to look for it online. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Perfect. Please continue.
National report, yeah. It was presented to Parliament. So there was a presentation to Parliament on it, and I think it was also presented to provinces. So both of those, I also have those presentations. I can send them to you. Okay. Then when was the report? Pleasure. When was this report compiled? So we worked on this report the whole of last year. We released the executive summary in December of last year and the finalized report in March of this year. And we tried to do it to coincide with the end of the 20-year implementation plan of White Paper 6. So White Paper 6 was published in 2001, and it had a 20-year plan that within 20 years we would have achieved the goals of inclusive education. And so we tried to look at it from that perspective of a review of that 20-year plan, essentially. And then in terms of the engagement we've had on it, we have engaged with the Western Cape Education Department, Inclusive Education Directorate, Sagomani Naika and Berenice Daniels. And we have also engaged the Inclusive Education Directorate nationally. What we have agreed with the IE directorates nationally is that it is not a report that requires only feedback from the IE directorate. It's what we've been trying to say, that inclusive education does not just affect an inclusive education directorate, particularly when the inclusive education directorate nationally is really only mandated with special schools. So there are other directorates like curriculum, assessment, social cohesion, who all need to be inputting infrastructure, who all need to be inputting into what are we doing as an entire education department to address these issues. Promotion and progression is not an issue that is dealt with by the Inclusive Education Directorate. LGBTQI learners, victimization, discrimination, that's dealt with in social cohesion. So our concern is that when people hear inclusive education report, they think this is the IE directorate, this is about special schools, and in fact it's not. So we have continued to engage with the DG. He has in the last week sent us a reply where numerous directorates gave a response to some of our recommendations, and he has invited us to engage further on those recommendations. So we are hoping that we will be able to get further engagement with the National DBE across multiple directorates to try and seriously grapple with some of our recommendations. What we're hoping is, you know, we didn't try and produce this report to be adversarial. We took the time to do this research to try and produce something that would give us some well-grounded recommendations to grapple with, that we could debate, that we could say, are these workable? Can we look at them? This is what the research shows. How do we go ahead? So it really, the goal of this report and this research was to try and come up with recommendations that collectively, as multiple stakeholders, including Parliament, including the DBE, civil society, that we could all say, how do we get us from where we are now to where we need to be in a far shorter time than we have spent on this already, essentially. In terms of admission policies, yes, so I think what we're asking for is uniformity across our admission policies. There are some inconsistencies, and yes, absolutely all children should be guaranteed equal access to education. And so we do just need, you know, there are provisions in SASSA, for example, Section 5, Section 12.4, that do speak about learners with special education needs accessing ordinary schools. They're not really sufficient, so we do just need some reforms there. And in terms of your comments on data, you're right, it is absolutely critical, because if you know that you have 300,000 children out of school, you need to plan, budget for, and make arrangements to have those children placed in school. If it's 20,000 children out of school, that's a totally different picture. But if you have no idea what the picture is, how do you begin to plan? How do you begin to actually account for the learners that need to be in schools? So, and that is why all of the international monitoring bodies like the UNCRPD, the UNCRC, the African Union have all called on the South African government to produce effective disaggregated data. And it's been something that we haven't yet gotten right, and it's something that we absolutely need to. Then in terms of learners being on waiting lists, so yeah, the causes of waiting lists are varied. So children end up on waiting lists, either they are in an ordinary school and the school has recommended they be placed in a special school. The special school is full, and so the child remains in an ordinary school until they're placed in a special school. Other times children are out of school, they're not in any schooling environment. Most often the only reason children are placed on a waiting list is because special schools claim to be full and don't have place. What is disappointing is that parents of children who are out of school are not provided with alternatives. And, you know, the reality is, and it's not necessarily in the Western Cape, but certainly nationally, there are learners who have literally been out of school for years. And there are some children at the ages of 10, 11, 12 who've never yet set foot in a school. So, you know, that's the reality of what's happening on the ground. There's no point to us trying to deny it. It's sad. It is a violation of children's right to education. We've got to get it right. And the solution cannot be to place a child on a waiting list indefinitely. That child has an immediate right to education. We have to make a plan. And again, that's why I'm saying this idea of you can only educate a child in a special school can't be our default mode anymore. We have to be looking at making sure, and I'm really interested to stay in this meeting and listen to the department's presentation on the inclusion of children with special education needs in ordinary schools, because that is our answer. And then just in terms of the funding model, your final question, yeah, it's a tough one. I think this is where we're really calling on all stakeholders to really consider this. Our biggest disappointment was when the funding norms were not passed by the Council of Education Ministers as norms, but as guidelines, because the implications of that meant that actually no money was going to be made available, and it was just a guidance. And unfortunately, we know that in the competing demands for funding, if you are only told this is how you're guided to spend money, you don't necessarily do it. And so there's no enforceability there. So, you know, to try and apply pressure for funding norms would be the best way forward. But there are also, you know, other ways of trying to be more innovative with fiscal space. And there's a whole chapter in our report that looks at some of the ways to create some fiscal space in the more short term to be able to provide some immediate funding while we look at longer term funding models. There's also quite a good analysis in the report on the different types of funding models that are available and what that norms and standards for resourcing inclusive education, the model that proposed. Yeah, so I hope that answers all your questions, and happy to take some more.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bria. I know from a funding model in the budget committee that the budget committee for the past, I think, 2-3 financial years have in their negotiating mandate on the division of revenue recommended to National Treasury that they include special needs education as well within the provincial equitable share formula, given that, you know, depending on the disability, we get money per learner in our respective schools. Colleagues, I'm going to open up for a second round of questions before we go over to the next presentation. Okay, if none, then I just want to say thank you so much to Ms. Bria and her team for the presentation. We always appreciate it when we are able to get some extra information on topics related to education. I think something that we can say is that we all want to make sure that the children in the Western Cape have quality education, and we're trying our best to make sure that we are able to deal with topics such as inclusive education. I know some people still speak of it as special needs education, including myself until recently. So we do appreciate the recommendation business. Thank you so much.
Thank you, we appreciate it.
No problem. Mr. Naik?
Yeah. Good morning, Honorable Chairperson. You want me to speak?
Wonderful. Mr. Naik, is there anything specific that you wanted to add? I know there were some questions to the WCD, but I was wondering if you didn't want to first do your presentation first. I do think that some of the slides in your presentation might address some of those questions anyway.
No, thank you, Chairperson. Mrs. Daniels is going to make the presentation, and I'm sure it's going to, and Mr. Daniels will speak to a lot of the issues that's been raised.
Sorry, Chair.
Apologies, Member Fry.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but he's very soft on my side. I don't know if anybody else is experiencing that.
No problem. Mr. Naik, if you can maybe just use your drama voice and project.
Okay. I don't have a drama voice, but I'm going to try. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and I think you're doing wonderfully. Thank you.
Thank you. So Honorable Chairperson, honorable members, I just want to make some introductory comments, and my colleague, Mrs. Daniels, will address a lot of these issues. I just wanted to say at the outset that our presentation was sent late last night, and because it is a big file, it probably was some delays, but I hope you got it in time. And I just also want to say that we appreciate and respect our relationship with Ms. Dia. It's a of educationists. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Okay,
Yes,
good.
I can hear you, Mr. Naika.
Okay. So I just want to make a few comments, right, and about the complexities. And you mentioned that special education, call it special education, it's a shift to inclusive education. So that's a big.
Apologies, Mr. Naika. Member Syed?
Chair, I think like Mr. Fry, I'm not sure, it's still a bit faint, and I've got my volume on full. I can't hear Mr. Naika very clearly. Thanks. It
No problem,
was
Mr. Naika,
sounding
maybe.
fine now a few seconds ago, but now it's again faint. Thanks.
Okay, so
no problem.
How do
I'm just
I
going to
sound
also
now?
check.
How do I sound now? Can you hear
I can
me?
hear you. Member
Better
Syed, are
now.
you able to hear?
Okay,
Perfect.
better now.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So, Chairperson, you mentioned that, and so I just thought I'll make a few introductory comments. So the introduction of inclusive education in our country through White Paper 6, it constituted a paradigm shift. Now, a paradigm shift in the social sciences involves a shift in assumptions. Firstly, a shift in theory, a shift in assumptions, a shift in models, a shift in practices, and a shift in tools. So what that means for the education system is systemic reform. So that's why, we don't only talk about inclusive education in the directorate or in the chief directorate. We speak about it across the branches, across the directorates, in our department, in the Western Cape Education Department. And, because we've realized as a WCD that this is not an easy task, as Ms. Bia points out. It's a very complex task, right? So I just want to refer you to the international environment, because we are forced to look at the international environment to see what they are doing because of the Salamanca statement that Mrs. Bia spoke about, and the developments that have taken place in England, the United States, in Canada, in Australia, and so on. And what we found is that in Canada, where there's very glorified reports about inclusive education, they also experience challenges in a very highly resourced country with a very educated population who earn a much higher salaries than people that do in the Western Cape. I mean, if you look at the Pero document, you'll see that about quarter of our population earn around 2,500 Rand per month. So that has implications for education. It has implications for curriculum. It has implications for how we deliver education. So one of the ways in which we can deal with the situation that we find ourselves in is to implement inclusive education, and therefore our international research. I also want to point out to you that, in the United States and in the United Kingdom, they've struggled with a working class challenge for 150 years. I'm talking about the working class challenge as it relates to education. And if you note that the Ofsted, which is the evaluating body in the UK, they've adopted cultural capital in their curriculum development in 2019. But the whole notion of cultural capital was advanced 100 years ago by Pierre Bourdieu. So what I'm saying is that it's a challenge, it's a complexity, and we are not alone in the struggle. But I must tell you, as someone who has looked at the international environment, we've made a lot of progress in the Western Cape. And one of the interactions we've had is with the universities. Because universities cannot produce knowledge that's written 50 years ago and that is not relevant to our current context. Their narrative has to be about producing knowledge about our schools and about education, teaching, and learning so that we can benefit from that research. So Mrs. Daniels has worked with the British Council and the CPUT and other universities in the Western Cape to fast track our engagement with universities. So we're very relevant. We are very aware of our context in the Western Cape. And we apply our minds to that context because your education cannot be divorced from the realities that confront the ordinary person in Western Cape society, right? So those introductory comments, I'm going to ask Ms. Daniels to show a slide and a slide presentation and make a presentation. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Mr. Naika. I was about to say that we don't even need to see the presentation anymore. Ms. Daniels, you're welcome to flag the presentation. Thank you so much.
Good. Hi, good morning. Here is Ms. Daniels. Good morning to the Standing Committee and the participants. Goeiemorgen, Malweni, and also in sign language, greeting anybody who's perhaps using sign language as their home language. I'm going to flag the presentation now.
Yes, you may continue. In terms of translation, if members want, they do have the option of Xhosa and Afrikaans translation if they are on different devices. But also I tested the captions a few days ago on a different meeting. So I saw MS Team has a caption option. It's not 100% perfect, but it does help with following the conversation if you do wish to read rather instead of listening to the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. Just want to check that you are seeing the first slide.
Yes, can see it. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to, following on Siamari Naika, I'm also just going to sketch the context for inclusive education, international, national, and provincial. So just to say internationally, there are different understandings of inclusive education. And he has mentioned one of the countries that has gone for full inclusion, where they don't have special schools. And those countries are Canada, like he mentioned, and in Europe, Italy is also an example of a country that has gone for full inclusion, no special schools. We haven't gone for that model in this country. There was a national commission in 1996, 1997, and it was felt that the context of South Africa at the time, and probably still prevailing today, is that it's not a feasible model for us, and we've gone for a continuum of inclusion, which I'm going to be speaking more about as I go through the presentation. So our policy document on inclusive education is Education White Paper 6, subtitle Building an Inclusive Education and Training System. And as has been mentioned by Ms. Beer, it was intended, the first implementation period was from 2001 to 2021. What is that white paper saying? So I'm just going to highlight the main points coming out of the white paper. There's a move from a focus only on special needs, that's assuming that there's a deficit that the child has, it's with a within-child model, to focus also on barriers to learning and development within the system, a systems change or a social rights model. I've mentioned just now that we also speak about a continuum of provision from mainstream or ordinary schools with support and they would have low intensity support, to full service or inclusive schools with a medium intensity support, to special schools with high intensity support. The white paper also said that actions in the short to medium term were intended to provide models and clarity on capital, how much it would cost, material and human resource development requirements for system-wide applications. So there was a period of piloting the white paper, which started as from about 2002. In the short term, there were audits done. There was a selection of schools to pilot. There were 3 districts in this province which piloted. That was Eden and Central Karoo, Metro South and Metro East. And a special school and an ordinary school were chosen. The ordinary school to be converted into a full service inclusive school, and a special school to be converted into a special school resource center. And I'm going to explain those terms as I go along. Let's start with full service inclusive schools. The White Paper 6 envisaged that all schools would over time become inclusive centers of learning, care, and support. There would be provision of specialized support services throughout the system, ranging from low or moderate to high levels of provision, and that the scope of personnel would range from full-time staff in those full service inclusive schools to coordinate the support at the school, teaching assistants, as well as access to visits by outreach teams from the districts or from the special school resource centers. White Paper 6 further envisaged that full service schools would be ordinary schools resourced at a moderate level of support to cater for learners with additional support needs or disabilities. And Ms. Beer also in her presentation alluded to whether when we talk about barriers to learning or special education needs, are we only talking about disabilities? And I think here it clarifies that it's not just disabilities, but learners who need additional support, which could be learning support, therapeutic support, psychosocial support, etc. The first full service schools would be flagship schools and models of good practice and inclusion to be emulated by other ordinary schools. And over the last few weeks, you might have heard of a school here in the province, in Cape Town, Pinelands North Primary School, which was a forerunner of these full service schools, and in fact was selected to be one of the world's best schools in managing diversity and adversity. But there are many more that we are developing into flagship schools, and I'll be talking about that in a moment. So inclusive education in South Africa is arguably not something which has to happen in addition to education reform, but one of the means through which social and education transformation can be achieved. This is a diagram which we got from EMIS. It's the distribution of special schools nationally. I think with the last census, this is the data that's come through from Statistics South Africa. And you can see, if you're looking at our province, that the special schools are clustered in the metro areas, and then just in the peri-urban areas, we're talking about sort of the Worcester area, Paarl, etc. And then we have a few special schools dotted around the province, right up as far as Oudtshoorn and George. When we look at full service schools, you see a different picture. Just to say, Robin was mentioning about the Northern Cape, and you can see how few special schools they have. It is, of course, quite a rural province with large distances between the main centres. But the pattern is the same. You look at the Eastern Cape, you can see also special schools concentrated around the urban or peri-urban nodes. This is the picture of the distribution of full service schools nationally. And again, you can see better distribution. If you look at the Western Cape in particular, you will see that we have tried to establish full service schools across the province. We have 64 circuits in the province, and we have tried to establish a full service school or more in every circuit. So you can see the reach of full service schools. What guides the practices in full service schools? Well, the DBE launched a document in 2010 called the Guidelines for Full Service Inclusive Schools. I may just say that before that, the province had designated some full service schools, but without having guidelines. And we've gone through another process where we've used the guidelines to designate more full service schools which are aligned to what is expected. They also released a guideline document to ensure quality education and support in special schools and special school resource centers. So again, just alluding to the previous presentation, before a school can do outreach work, it has to be strengthened as a special school. And hence the title of this document, Ensuring Quality Education and Support in Special Schools, firstly, and then some of them to be special school resource centers doing the outreach work. There's also a guideline document for responding to learner diversity in the classroom through CAPS, or the Curriculum and Assessment Policy Statements, and that is a challenge that CAPS does not become a barrier to learning, but that we find ways of making the curriculum accessible to the diversity of learners that are found in most classrooms. In 2014, at the end of 2014, a very important document was promulgated. It's called, by its acronym, SIAS. It stands for Screening, Identification, Assessment and Support. And it has the force of policy. I've just included the approval, and just to show that it has been gazetted as a policy document. And I'm going to talk more about SIAS. It really has helped to guide the provision of support, low, moderate, and high. So recently, there's been a visit by the Department of Basic Education to the province. They visited 2 districts, one rural and one metro district, in September of 2022. So the intention of the expansion of inclusive education is to support learners who experience barriers to learning in public ordinary schools, beginning with those schools which have been identified for conversion into full service schools, and to strengthen the outreach of special schools. Special schools which have been identified to be transformed into resource centers will offer support programs to the identified full service schools and learners with moderate support needs in other public ordinary schools. And during the visit, they visited a sample of our full service schools, special school resource centers, ordinary schools, and just were looking at how the province was doing in terms of implementing inclusive education. There are serious funding challenges which have already been mentioned, but despite that, we have tried our very best as a Western Cape Education Department, as a province, to implement the recommendations in White Paper 6, the intentions of White Paper 6. And I do want to tell you that that the delegation that was here from DBE felt that in this province a lot had been done, and were really pleased with the progress that had been made, noting, of course, that there are resource constraints. So the outcome of the 9 provincial visits is to inform the expansion of inclusive education. So This has also been mentioned that there are these guidelines for resourcing inclusive education. It's a draft document. It was published in 2018 for public comment. And as was said, it ideally should have been norms and standards. So the resourcing proposals incorporate public special schools and public ordinary schools, particularly full service schools. The resourcing proposals include compensation of employees and the non-personnel, non-capital allocation, mainly in the form of transfers to schools. So recently, the provincial education departments were requested to do a costing for a HEDCOM subcommittee on finance meeting in September 2022, which the province did. Our finance and our strategic people management directorates. And the costed guidelines are going to be subjected to the sector process, the political process. So that's where it is. It's all quite recent. Okay, so then I thought I should just give you a profile of inclusive education in the province. We understand that inclusive education is everyone's business, but the staff members that are specifically tasked with spearheading the expansion of inclusive education are as follows. I'm going to start on the right-hand side. At the district level, we have 8 inclusive and specialized learner and educator support management teams. There are 64 circuit support teams, and in each circuit support team, there's a psychologist, a social worker, and a learning support advisor. And then at our special school resource centers, we have outreach teams. It's the first province to institute outreach teams from the special school resource centers, and we have 22. At the provincial level, you have heard Dr. Sigamani Naika, he's the Chief Director for Inclusive Education and Special Projects. And then myself, Director Inclusive and Specialized Education Support. At the head office, we have a Chief Education Specialist for Specialized Support Services and 6 program managers for therapy, social work, psychology, behavior, health services, and also learning support. Then we have 6 program managers and a chief education specialist for special schools, and that's for the different domains of specializations, for example, visual impairment, hearing impairment, etc. Deaf, blind, specific learning disability, SID, autism spectrum disorder, etc. There's 6 program managers. And then also in our directorate, we have the HIV, TB, life skills, and care and support program. We're one of the few provinces that have this within the inclusive education directorate, and it's really good because care and support goes together with inclusive education. Then just for all of you to know, and most of you do know this already, we have 8 districts in the province, 64 circuits. We have started phase 1 of capacity building of full service schools. There are 64 schools in phase 1 per circuit, and we will shortly go on to selecting a second school in each circuit to be a demonstration or flagship full service school. And then we have 74 public special schools. We have recently added 2. The one is in Clanwilliam and the other one is in Manenberg. But we are focusing on expanding full service inclusive schools. All right, so I'm just going to show it to you in another way. So this continuum of support that we were talking about. So low-level support is in most of our ordinary schools. We have learning support, or what used to be called remedial teachers, itinerant, working between 2 or more schools in most of our primary schools. And then our full-service inclusive schools, there is a full-time learning support or remedial teacher. And then I mentioned that some of our special schools have outreach teams, and those outreach teams mostly work to support those full service inclusive schools. Then if you look at in the bottom bar, that is the district-based support teams. And as was rightly pointed out in the previous presentation, that is not only the inclusive and specialized education support personnel, but just to say that there are 64 ISLE support teams, and you can see there what the support teams are made up of. And then we also have circuit managers, subject advisors, etc. at district level who are part of the broader district-based support teams. We have developed a pathway which is based on SIAS, the Screening, Identification and Assessment Support Document. And I'm just going to take you through it very briefly. We have a very thorough process to make sure that the learners that are in special schools are the ones that really need high support, maybe not forever, but for a time. So we do annual review of placement. It wasn't always like that. In the past, special schools could admit whoever they felt needed their support. And it happened then that many learners who could really have benefited from being in an ordinary school support were admitted. But over the years now, we are changing that picture, and our special schools attest to that the right learner with high level support is now being referred to their schools. So who can refer? A teacher, a parent, a guardian, a health practitioner can identify a learner as experiencing a barrier to learning, having a special educational need, needing psychosocial support, etc. And what we expect is that, first of all, the classroom teacher needs to do an intervention. Again, alluding to the previous presentation, the challenge has been that the vast majority of teachers have not had a module on inclusive education or special educational needs as part of their pre-service teacher training. That is all changing. There is a module that's been developed, and I'm going to be talking about the course in a moment, but it's called Teaching for All, and it is, I think by next year, it will be mandatory for all teachers in teacher training to do the Teaching for All course, whether as a standalone course or infused into the period as teacher trainees. But we, as a province, we have taken the initiative to pilot some of the modules from the pre-service or university level course. And we've given feedback to the British Council, who were coordinating the provision of this course. I think they got the tender together with other role players. And there is now an in-service version of Teaching for All, and we are systematically rolling that out to our ordinary teachers, ordinary classroom teachers, but I'll say more about that shortly. So in brackets there, you'll see there's a series of forms that need to be completed, tools, the SIAS support needs one, and then we expect a teacher to develop an individual support plan, or if there are a few learners with a similar problem in a school, in a class, the GSP or the group support plan. If that's not sufficient, they can refer to school-based support teams, and we know about the challenges with school-based support teams. It's really difficult because all the members are also have other responsibilities, like classroom teachers, like deputy principals, members of the SMT, etc. And we look forward to the norms and standards for inclusive education, because in the guidelines, it is recommended that there is a staff member who will be part-time as the coordinator of the school-based support team and have some free periods to do that coordination. So we're looking forward to that. So what can the school-based support team recommend? They can recommend learning support. They can ask for a diagnostic scholastic assessment. or withdrawal for learning supports in languages or mathematics. But the learning support teacher can also help with differentiation of the curriculum. So out of that discussion, it could be that there's learning support, as I've just said, but it could also be that the SPST recommends additional class teacher intervention. Sometimes you have very experienced members of staff on that school-based support team who can help other novice teachers with ideas of how they can address the barrier that the learner has, or they might be able to share a similar case that they've had and how they've dealt with it, and in that way enrich the skills of their colleagues. That school-based support team also sometimes refers to the school nurse or to community service, but all of that is still happening at the level of the school. If that is not sufficient, a referral can be made to the circuit or cluster-based support team, or if it is a full-service school, to the inclusive education support team. They will also consult with the district-based support team, which could include curriculum, assessment, etc. But that is also the stage where there can be a consultation with intersectoral partners, other government departments, NGOs, etc. Out of that discussion, there will be a decision about whether it's low-level support that's needed, moderate level or high-level support, and importantly, always involve the parent and guardian. So we have a checklist to ask where the teacher has to indicate whether they have involved the parent or the guardian. If there are issues coming out of those discussions that seem to affect a large number of learners, we ask that the district refers to the provincial-based support team. And sometimes the provincial-based support team needs to escalate that to the Department of Basic Education. And we have done that on a number of occasions to say we notice these trends in the province. This is our recommendation, or say, can we have a discussion about that? For example, we pick up a lot of learners who at grade 4 have not mastered reading for comprehension. Now, that is not really a problem. Yes, there will be some children who won't. Most children should learn to read for meaning by the end of grade 3. So that is when our curriculum counterparts need to come up with a plan. And as you will know, in this province, as from 2022, that is one of the priorities of the province to enhance foundation phase literacy and numeracy and its whole of departments. So our learning support people, our psychologists, our social workers, we all involved together with curriculum in trying to enhance and improve literacy and numeracy in the foundation phase. Sometimes we will say that support can be given in the classroom and give tips on what could be done. I just want to alert you to the arrow on the side, which says serious cases are referred to high-level support immediately. For example, a case of abuse. You know, you're not going to go through all these stages. There's a hotline then to the district. Okay, and that's just the key. We use so many acronyms in education. So SNA, support needs assessment, ISP is an individual support plan, GSP, group support plan, and IE is the inclusive education outreach team. We work very closely with the Department of Health, and there is a form for them in the CIAS as well, which is called the Health and Disability Form. And we have a project with Red Cross Hospital at the moment to automate that, because we used to get handwritten notes from doctors referring learners, and sometimes we couldn't understand the handwriting, but other times it would get lost along the way. So we are piloting an electronic system which is working so well so far, and we will refine it, and then it will be available to all practitioners in the Department of Health that refer to us. Okay, all right. So as you heard, there was an audit of full service schools across the country. So those findings that were mentioned by Equal Education Law Centre is an aggregate of all the provinces. We were told that there were 2 provinces that did quite a bit better, but it's in the presentation they didn't disclose. We hope that the Western Cape was one of them. But we've done our own full service school support visits this year. We visited every one of those 64 schools, and it was a team made up of head office officials, district office officials, circuit team, as well as the inclusive education outreach team. And we spent half a day at each of the schools. I'm just going to show you some pictures, make it come alive. So we also help schools in accessibility features. So you can see the ramps, adapted pollution facilities, a wheelchair lift. We also have given assistive devices. We have a budget for assistive devices, and on the right-hand side, you see the reader pen there. And those pens are very useful for learners who have a specific learning disability, also used to be known as dyslexia. And then GoTalk, those are for the non-verbal learners, and especially those that have intellectual difficulties. So you can just press your finger and and it will talk. So that's been very useful for non-verbal learners. Then you also see on the left-hand side, we've adapted this desk for the learner so that it's sloping and they're more able to access the schoolwork like that. All right, so moving on to the Teaching for All training. So as I mentioned, it was a collaborative effort funded by the European Union and involved the Higher Education and Training Department, the British Council, UNISA, and MIT Africa, which is a resources development organization. So these are the modules, and as you go through it, you can see this is the kind of thing that we want all of our teachers to know. Unit 1 is on inclusivity in education. Unit 2 is on learner diversity. So in inclusivity in education, the teachers learn about the context of exclusion and how the policies of inclusion were developed, the principles and values of inclusion in South Africa, and the theories and models of inclusive education. Like I mentioned at the beginning, that some countries see inclusion as no special schools, some opt for a continuum, etc. Then they move on, and there's a unit on learner diversity, intersectionality, which could include that the learner has a disability, as well as maybe coming from an impoverished community, so it intersects equity. The importance of language, culture, and learning for to be attentive to that, because often language gets misconstrued as being a learner being unable to cope with the curriculum, but it could be because they are learning it in their second or their third language. So teachers are made aware that they need to be cognizant of that. And then non-visible differences. It's very easy to see when a learner has a physical disability or is wearing hearing aids or spectacles, but there are also non-visible differences. For example, autism spectrum disorder, but their whole range, and I think the chairperson mentioned that in the last standing committee presentation. Then inclusive school communities. This is where we talk about the South African framework, the tools for building inclusive schools, CRs, etc. We speak about teacher agency and social justice. So what can teachers do in their classroom? What can schools do without waiting for the department, as they sometimes refer to us, although we're all the department, the schools, the teachers, everybody, we're all part of the department. And then practices that promote collaboration. For example, there's the care and support for teaching and learning framework. I'll talk about that later. But the one that the unit that the teachers love the most is the inclusive teaching and learning unit. This is where they get exposed to strategies to support learning for all, the principles of inclusive pedagogy. So as we've been training teachers from the 64 schools now, we do go through unit 1, 2, and 3. But what I've asked the presenters to do is to also, with every session, give a slice of unit 4, because this is really what teachers are hungry to know. What must I do differently in my classroom? And according to my colleagues, Harriet and Diane, who are running the support sessions together with the inclusive education outreach teams, that has been very well received. It's really grounded teaching for all. So as I've mentioned, we starting with the demonstration or the flagship schools in 2022, and next year we'll move to phase 2 and eventually make the course available to all schools. And we are speaking to our Cape Teaching and Leadership Institute about rolling it out to all schools. As part of the package of support that we give to full service inclusive schools, we've also been very fortunate to have received an offer of funded training on diversity training, Sonadol training. It's the company. And we are doing that at each one of our 64 schools. And diversity includes issues around LGBTI, it includes disability, it includes so-called color or race, and so on. So if you are going to be an inclusive school, you need to be inclusive in all aspects. And the dolls refer to dolls that are diverse. So there's a doll in a wheelchair. There's a doll with albinism and so on. So and these stories to go with it, and especially in the primary school, the learners really love this. It just brings it all to life, and they're learning good life lessons from this. Then the framework for working with other government departments is the Key and Support for Teaching and Learning framework, which recognizes that the child is in the center, and first of all, the education department, the teacher, the school-based support team, the school management should, as far as possible, address all of the needs of the child, but we also need the parent to be involved, extended family, the foster parents, other caregivers, Department of Health, Home Affairs, Agriculture, SAP, Social Development, NGOs, development agencies, etc. And with the full service schools, we always start our projects there, and so we are making sure that they also are reaching out to all these other support structures and people in their community. So we encourage them to map the resources that are available to the school. We have at a provincial level, we are collaborating very closely with the Departments of Health, Department of Social Development, Department of Cultural Affairs and Sport, and we meet regularly, especially now that we have a project on mental health or well-being promotion. So, in conclusion, COVID-19 has forced the whole world to review and reset. Inclusive education in South Africa is not something which has to happen in addition to education reform, but one of the means through which social and education transformation can be achieved in the new normal. And I hope that through this presentation, you've seen that this is not about a few learners. This is about being inclusive of everyone, teaching for all. How do we create an inclusive ethos in our schools so that the needs of all the learners are catered for and they develop optimally. Chairperson, I wasn't sure the level of detail that we needed to go in. So this is an overview, and we are more than welcome to answer any questions. You're more than welcome to ask any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Daniels. We really appreciate it. It's been a lot of information, but I do know that we have previously also sent the members the white paper that your presentation is based on. I think I also posted it on one of our education WhatsApp groups after our previous cluster oversight week, which Mr. Naika was so wonderful in sending so quick to us. Members, I'm going to take the first round of hands. If there are none, I'm happy to start first, but okay, I see one hand. Is there a second hand? Going once, going twice. Okay, member side, and then I'll go after him. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, and my thanks to the department for the presentation. I also note the opening remarks made by Mr. Naika, and I do appreciate that just in terms of the relationship with the committee. But I want to put on record, Chair, that it is disappointing that the presentation did come late. I think the department needs to know that. I understand Wasima raised issues about the size, because I mean, we only got it this morning. So very little time to prepare and to properly engage with the presentation. I think it must not happen again. If there are technical issues, they need to find a quick solution to basically overcome that. But be that as it may, on slide number 6, just wanted to get a sense as to how far are we from attaining the vision that is spoken about, inclusive education. What support is given to public ordinary schools that are currently admitting learners with special needs? Do they meet the norms and standards for these learners? Then slide 15, what are the details of the schools that have been identified for conversion into full service centers? What resources are they currently getting?
Member side, I'm not sure if it's my internet or yours perhaps, but you tailed off after the resources for the full service schools. Members, I just want to check if you're able to hear me, just in case it's my problem on my side.
I can hear you, Chair. You also tailed it off my side.
Okay.
That's
what
fine.
I'll
Thank
do
you
is...
for now.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you. So member side, your last question was regarding the resources.
The resources, Chair.
Okay.
But I'm not going to, I
perfect.
think, look, we'll also go a little bit more into that when we go into the medium-term budget, but they can possibly touch on that. I just wanted a little bit on that. Thanks.
No problem. Thank you so much. If there are no other hands, then I'll also just pose my questions now. On slide 16, it spoke to the fact that the Provincial Education Departments requested a costing for the EDCOM subcommittee in September, and that these costed guidelines will now be subjected to the sector's approval process. Either Ms. Daniels or Mr. Naika, if you could just maybe send this to us, and if there's maybe a timeline when you're expecting the sector to complete this engagement, if you know about that. And then secondly, regarding the implementation of the recommendations of White Paper 6, I think while you've shown that a lot has already been done, perhaps if it would be possible to, perhaps on a biannual basis, send us a written report, perhaps on the progress of the respective outcomes that have been implemented. I don't think it would be necessary for a briefing every 6 months or so, but perhaps a documentation in this regard. Further on slide, apologies, let me just see here. Slide 19, you were speaking about the pilot project at the Red Cross Hospital where you're piloting an electronic system. I just wanted to find out, is that where the doctors write recommendations for the learners to go to a special needs school and have specialized skills available to them? If so, how many doctors are currently in the pilot? How many learners are currently being supported by the particular pilot? When do you aim to roll the pilot out to the other schools? And if it would be possible for us to just, I'm not sure if it would be POPI aligned, but if it is, if we could please have a list of the doctors that are participating in the pilot. I do think as a committee, it might be useful for us to ask the doctors what the user experience has been of the electronic systems and where we could possibly improve it. I know with a lot of electronic systems, you create the system, you get input, you improve it, and it's kind of a bit of a cycle of improvement on those type of systems. And then you also mentioned the module in the teacher training that's being developed and that you would like to implement it for next year. Is there perhaps a timeline for when you would like to implement it? You said it would be mandatory, so I'm assuming that all teachers will then be involved in this particular training. Okay, I'm going to keep my questions to those and then I'll open up for another round afterwards. Ms. Daniels, Mr. Naika, you can allocate the questions accordingly. Thank you so much.
I just want to quickly say that I note the honourable members Said's point, and I will we will ensure that that doesn't happen again. Thank you so much. Mrs. Daniels will answer the questions.
Thank you. Perhaps I'll just start with the last one about Red Cross Hospital. So there are about 6 of the doctors there that are using the system at the moment. So it's really an electronic version of our CIOS DBE 126. And we've made some additions to that. I could certainly ask Dr. Richard, who's coordinating the project, Mark Richards, to give us the names of those doctors and get comments on the user experience. I think we've also had to engage them in a bit of a mind shift because before learners used to be referred for placement at a special school. But we are saying that not all of the learners that have a diagnosis of a disability necessarily need to go to a special school. So what has been happening recently is that we refer those or those electronic referrals are sent to the district inclusive and specialized learning educator support component to see whether the learner could be in a full service school with support, an ordinary school with support. And of course, once a determination is made that is a learner with very high level support, then they'd be referred for possible placement at a special school. But we could certainly give you the numbers that are being referred. And in terms of when will we roll it out, I think that by the end of this year, Dr. Richards has been on sabbatical. As soon as he's back, we will have a review of it. And if there are any changes that need to be made to the electronic document, we will make that. And then we can roll it out. Our idea is to roll it out to the big hospitals first, like to the next hospital which we will approach would be Tygerberg Hospital, but eventually it could be a province-wide referral tool. Then in terms of the guidelines, so as the guidelines for resourcing an inclusive education system, each province was asked to pass those guidelines to say what they already have in place, what will be needed to implement the guidelines in full. So as mentioned, that has been presented at a HEDCOM subcommittee. I am not sure what the process is thereafter, but we can certainly speak to our finance colleagues as to the next steps with that. And then the details of the schools. Yes, we have identified one school per circuit, and we can certainly make those pull the names of those schools available. As I mentioned, there is a package of services that we are giving to those schools. So when we go in as a team, we do a survey, an inclusive education survey. And from that, we can see where the school has needs, what capacity building is needed. And we then offer the Teaching for All course, which is being converted into an online course by our directed e-learning. So they are invited to register for that course. And then every 2 weeks, we have an online support session for the schools. And so many teachers have registered for the course already. Next year, we hope to expand it to the next cohort of schools, 64 schools. But as soon as we are ready to make that available to all schools, we will. So that is the in-service version of Teaching for All. You asked about the mandatory comment that I made. So that is for pre-service teachers. So teachers in teacher training. Many of the universities now are offering Teaching for All. And I think that it's going to be mandatory if you're going to be trained as a teacher in future, that you need to either do the standalone Teaching for All course, or the universe. And what some universities have done is to infuse it into appropriate courses that they're already running. So that will be become mandatory according to information that we received from DBE. Then in terms of support to ordinary schools, so the support that is given to ordinary school are those learning support teachers that are itinerant between 2 schools. And I do want to tell you that we are really, really pleased that this year we've been allocated an additional 86 posts in the post basket for learning support teachers, which will greatly increase the support to our public ordinary schools. So we will be recruiting those learning support teachers shortly. I think I've covered all of them, but if I've missed anything, Chairperson, please indicate it.
No, I think you have covered everything. I'm going to open up for another round of questions. Okay, if there are none, then I just want to say, okay, there's a hand that goes up. Member Syed, you need to make your coffee quicker in the background so you can put your hand up in time.
No, Chair, thank you. It's my first time I'm using Teams with this new app that they've installed for us. So it's a new look Teams.
Remember, we are young. You're gonna embarrass us live on YouTube if young people can't use MS Team apps. Thank you. Please go ahead.
So Chair, mine is just, and this is the end of it for me, on slide 19. I just wanted to get a sense. There's no mention of the development of plans to ensure that basically schools are accessible for learners with special needs in terms of the physical buildings of the schools, infrastructure issues. I just wanted to get a sense as to what are the plans in place in that regard. And then also, are there any measures in place in particular to deal with discriminatory practice such as bullying relating to issues of race, gender, class, etc.? Thank you. Because I know there are measures in place to deal with bullying in general. There's a program, but I just wanted to know with regards to these issues which speak to the program that we're talking about, inclusive education. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ms. Daniels?
Thanks, Chairperson. So all new schools are built to be accessible. So that is great. It's part of the building regulations, Section S, I believe, that all public buildings should be accessible, including schools. And so our challenge really lies with the older buildings. And I showed you some pictures of what we've done in terms of putting ramps in place and rails and so on. So we are doing at least 2 schools every year, 2 schools per district every year, making them accessible. And it's on demand. So, you know, if there's a learner or learners in a school, we will then plan together to make the school accessible. And also if there's any infrastructure work that is being done at a school, that we try and incorporate them, making the school accessible. And as a result of that, a number of learners, as Ms. Beer mentioned, who have a physical disability, but have good academic ability. There's no reason then for a learner to go to a special school. They can go to their local school or their school of choice. So that there's been a lot of progress over the years in terms of making schools accessible. Then at our full service schools, which are our demonstration schools or our flagship schools, we are asking a representative group of staff to do the persona doll training, and that does address issues of bullying, of discrimination against people who are differently abled. So that is part of the package that is offered to the full service schools. And then every district does have a budget for learner programs, for teacher capacity building around issues such as bullying. So that will be done at district level. That is the generic positive behavior budget.
Thank you so much, Ms. Daniels. I think what is also quite interesting in terms of the practices regarding bullying is at 2 schools now that we have visited over the last period, we found a project called the Harmony Project, where they deal with quite positive values and systems regarding discipline, that the committee on the cluster oversight made a resolution to actually invite them to the committee to try and understand what are they doing correctly. Because now that we've seen 2 schools that have that particular project in place, and one of these schools is obviously Pinelands North, that got into the top 3 for overcoming adversity in the world, which is quite wonderful. So we do have that on our schedule as well, to try and understand what can we do better in our schools to be able to deal with this particular problem. Colleagues, I'm hoping there are no urgent questions right now. I do think that we can probably deal with any follow-ups in the resolution phase, as we do have a number of administrative matters just to conclude before the end of the committee. But if there's any urgent questions, I will take them now. Okay, thank you so much. I just want to say, I know that both our stakeholders, I think, stayed on until the very end. I'm not too sure, but to both the EALC as well as the WCED, I just want to say thank you so much for your presentations on inclusive education. I think it's been very eye-opening, and I think it's going to really assist the committee in being able to say, what can we improve within our systems so that we can ensure that children with special needs also have the quality education that they deserve. You are welcome to stay for administration in the committee. However, I do advise that it would be very boring and you're welcome to go about your day-to-day activities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you so much. I'm just quickly going to ask the procedural officer just to which document we'll be dealing with first.
Okay, just to note that we won't be adopting any documents, but we are taking resolutions for the 14th of October's annual report, which members had not sent because the meeting had ended after 1 o'clock. And then the recommendations of today's meeting, which I've captured 2, 3 thus far, and then anything else that the members wish to add on.
Thank you so much. So what I'll do is let's first take the resolutions on the annual report, and then we can go through today's resolutions quickly. So members, if you have any specific resolutions regarding the annual report that you would like to ask now. Okay, if there are none, I'm going to then move over to today's meeting then for resolutions. If we can just quickly have it read out, what have we been capturing so far, and then we can always add on. Thanks.
Chair, through you, I've captured thus far the request for a biannual report from WCED on the outcomes that have been implemented, as well as the national costings on the HED COM subcommittee. And then also you would like the timeline for when it will be completed. You've also asked for the how many doctors. They've indicated 6 doctors are part of the pilot project, and you wanted to know how many learners are being supported. When will the rollout be per school and per circuit? The list of the doctors and the experience on using this rollout model. Ms. Daniels had given extensive info on it, but these are specific lists and numbers that you wanted. Let me see what else is there. I think that's about it. If there's anything that I've missed, if members can just add on, please.
Thank you so much. I do think that 1 or 2 of those questions have been answered. For example, how many doctors are in the pilot? That was 6, for example. So I just would like to know the rest in that regard. Members, are there any other resolutions for today's meeting? My suggestion also on the EELC ones would be that because a lot of the resolutions relate to national mandates, in terms of inclusive education, my suggestion would be just to submit that to the WCED and if possible to then to engage with national then on in that regard regarding some of the recommendations in that sense. And then I do think that we should just also recommend to the budget committee with the upcoming division of revenue adjustment negotiating mandate. I know that they've previously already included special education needs within the negotiating mandate for the provincial equitable share formula, but just to re-recommend that for this year, that if the National Treasury has not changed the formula yet to include it, for it to be reiterated, for it to be included, please. If members are in order with those.
No problem.
Okay, perfect. Ms. Hassan-Musa.
Okay, sorry, there's one recommendation that I'm noting now for Member Sayed, the 22 learners on the waiting list that was part of the EELC. He wanted the breakdown per district of those learners, if that is still what he requires.
Thank you so much. And I think once we gather information that we also just make sure that that it's sent to the department so that if there is any problems, that the department's able to deal with those. Thank you so much. Members, are you happy with those?
Happy, thanks.
Yes, happy.
Happy.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And members, there is a by-election also coming up. My suggestion for the program for education with the upcoming by-election is a lot of other committees are also moving their meetings online. So my suggestion for that week is for education to also move our meeting online, because I know a lot of members from different organizations have asked that they are able to deal with their logistics and operations in that week, and they might not necessarily be able to be hybrid for that week at Parliament. Would that be in order, members?
In order?
Okay, perfect.
Chair, which one are we talking about? Do we have
It's
a
the
meeting on the Tuesday, Chair?
Yes, it's on the day that there's going to be special votes, to my knowledge.
Ah, okay.
Yes.
So that's
So
the
the
one
suggestion-
of that's okay.
So
I
we
hear you.
invite
So
all the
suggestion-
departments.
Yeah.
That's where we're inviting
just-
like all of the departments under the sun.
Okay, it's not the one on unplaced learners, no, or what is it?
It includes
just-
it includes the admission process. It's 2 briefings.
Okay, so you're going to do it as hybrid, ne?
Online. Hybrid is when we're in a meeting physically and online. So the request has been that because members might be driving up and down, that we do it online.
Okay, I hear you. You see, ideally, given the kind of topic, one would have preferred a hybrid setting, but I do understand also that there's the by-elections, but the by-elections on the Wednesday, right?
Yes, so the by-election on Wednesday, and traditionally the IEC schedules the special votes the day before. I don't mind driving in, but I do know a number of members might be quite upset with me, making them drive into one town and then they have to drive back to another town afterwards.
So why don't we just keep it then as a hybrid? Those of us who can be in, we go in. Even if even if it's just 1 or 2 of us that are in the chamber. I was just thinking.
No problem. I can keep it hybrid if members are happy with that.
Okay.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cool. Ms. Hassan Musa, is there anything else that I've forgotten perhaps?
No, Chair, we've covered everything. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Members, thank you so much then for the meeting today. Thank you for your engagement, and I hope you have a lovely day further. The meeting is adjourned. Goodbye.
Thank you,
Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you.
All the best for you and the members.
Thank you.
Thank you.